Karen Ellingsworth thought she was untouchable. Victor Holloway knew better. While she built an entire neighborhood on land she didn't own, Victor watched from the shadows, patient, calculating, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By the time she realized the truth, it was too late. Victor Holloway never paid much attention to the land. It had been in his family for decades, passed down from his grandfather, who once dreamed of turning it into a cattle ranch. But the ranch never came to be, and the land was left as it had always been, 40 acres of wild, open space, framed by dense trees and sloping hills on the edge of the city. Over the years, Victor thought about selling it but never did. Something about it felt permanent, untouched, and strangely comforting. He figured he'd deal with it someday. Then came Karen Ellingsworth. She showed up with confidence and ambition, dressed in a crisp suit and speaking with the charm of someone who'd closed deals her entire life. Karen introduced herself as the president of the Willow Heights Homeowners Association, a name Victor had never heard before. She said she was looking for land to expand the community, land where they could build something modern, eco-friendly, and affordable. According to her, there was a shortage of well-planned neighborhoods in the city, and she had a blueprint in mind for a dream development: small, sustainable homes for young families, retirees, and everyone in between. She painted a picture of smiling children riding bikes, community gardens, weekend farmers markets, and tree-lined streets. She promised there would be no trouble, no legal hurdles, no shady deals. She didn't want to buy the land. She wanted permission to use it. Not permanently, just for a while, until the project found its legs. She told Victor he'd always have control and that she'd keep him updated. It would be a partnership in spirit, she said, but he'd remain the legal owner. All she needed was a chance to prove what she could do. Victor, who had never developed land and had no interest in doing so, agreed. He saw no harm in letting her try, especially since she claimed she wouldn't break ground without permits and approvals. It felt harmless. She seemed competent. Besides, the land had been idle for years. What was the worst that could happen? Karen sent over some light paperwork, just a basic usage agreement. Victor scanned it quickly and signed. He didn't hire a lawyer or ask too many questions. He trusted her because she seemed like the kind of person who knew what she was doing. He didn't even ask what she planned to build first. He figured she'd email him updates or maybe invite him down to visit when things started moving. But weeks passed, then months, and he heard nothing. At first, he didn't worry. He was busy with other projects, managing his small business and dealing with family matters. Every now and then, he thought about calling her, but figured she would reach out when something happened. Maybe she had changed her mind. Maybe the plan fell through. It wasn't until almost a year later that a friend sent him an aerial drone photo that made his stomach turn. The image showed a landscape that was unrecognizable. Where there had once been empty fields and shrubs, now stood row after row of identical houses neatly spaced, freshly painted and occupied. From the air, the place looked like a complete community. There were paved streets, sidewalks, streetlights, and even a playground. Dozens of vehicles were parked in driveways, and people were walking dogs or sitting on porches. Victor could barely believe it. He zoomed in and saw something that made his blood run cold. A large sign posted near the entrance of the development read, "Willow Heights Community, managed by the HOA. He hadn't given her permission to build 98 homes. He hadn't signed away development rights. He hadn't sold a single square inch of his land. Victor felt something shift in that moment. A knot formed in his gut, not just of confusion, but of betrayal. What had she done? How had this happened without a single call, letter, or update? He stared at the photo for a long time, trying to wrap his head around the fact that this entire neighborhood was sitting on land he still owned, and no one, not a single person, knew. Victor Holloway couldn't sleep the night he saw the drone photo. His mind raced with questions, each one more disturbing than the last. How could someone build an entire neighborhood without informing the landowner? What kind of deals had Karen made? Who had signed off on this? And most importantly, how much damage had already been done? He started digging the next morning. The first step was to contact the local building department. He expected resistance, but what he found was worse confusion. They couldn't find any recent permits issued under Victor's name. No transfer of ownership, no zoning variance applications, and certainly no approvals for nearly 100 new homes. Yet somehow the homes stood there, fully built, populated, and functioning as if everything had gone through the proper channels. Karen had somehow managed to fly completely under the radar. Victor's next stop was the county recorder's office, where he pulled every document related to his land. It was still in his name. No deed transfers, no liens, nothing that showed he had relinquished control. It was exactly as it had been for decades, legally his. Yet Willow Heights looked like it had existed for years. He started searching for public records on Karen Ellingsworth. What he found surprised him. Karen had formed a limited liability company about 14 months earlier under the name Ellingsworth Residential Solutions. That company had filed for business permits, opened a bank account, and most importantly registered as a contractor for small-scale residential projects. On paper, it looked harmless. A woman with a dream to build homes. But when Victor matched the company name with real estate listings in the area, he found dozens of properties listed for sale through her LLC. Nearly every home in Willow Heights had been listed, sold, or rented out using that company. She had sold homes on land she didn't own. Each listing described the neighborhood as a quiet, HOA-protected community with green certified homes and exclusive amenities. Some buyers paid in cash. Others financed through banks that likely assumed all paperwork was legitimate. Not once was Victor's name mentioned anywhere in the transactions. To the public, Karen appeared to be the rightful owner and developer. Victor realized the truth. She had forged a narrative and sold it to dozens of families, and they had bought into it completely. He drove out to the edge of the city for the first time in years to see the land in person. What he saw made the drone photo look mild. There were not just homes, there was an entire ecosystem. Garbage collection bins, HOA notices pinned to community boards, landscaping crews maintaining the small front lawns, and residents chatting on sidewalks. Children played basketball in cul-de-sacs. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically in front of pastel-colored houses. There was no security gate, no fences, just an open neighborhood on what was supposed to be his untouched land. Victor didn't get out of his car. He sat quietly, watching the activity. Everything looked picture-perfect on the surface, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a facade. Something about it felt artificial, like a movie set built for appearances. Clean paint, manicured. Lawns, but underneath lies stacked on top of more lies. Back home, he continued his research late into the night. It didn't take long before cracks in Karen's empire started to show. There were scattered complaints, online anonymous posts from homeowners describing issues with plumbing, flooding, poor insulation, and even houses settling unevenly. One post mentioned that a wall had begun cracking after just 3 months. Another claimed the HOA was aggressive, charging hefty fines for minor violations while ignoring major repair requests. These weren't just cosmetic problems. They pointed to rushed construction and cheap materials. Victor compiled everything: photos, documents, sales records, complaints. He wasn't sure what he was building yet. A case, a lawsuit, maybe something more. But he was certain of one thing: this wasn't just fraud. It was dangerous. Karen had not only deceived him, but she had put dozens of families at risk. Families who had no idea that their new homes sat on land they didn't legally own. Families who had invested their savings into a dream Karen sold. With a smile, Victor wasn't angry yet. He was calculating, watching, gathering. He knew there would be a time to act, but when he did, it had to be precise. For now, the empire stood tall. But he had already begun digging at its foundation. Victor Holloway's instincts told him something was wrong, deeply wrong. What started as a betrayal had turned into something more sinister, more tangled. The more he learned about Willow Heights, the clearer it became that the entire neighborhood was a carefully constructed illusion, built on a mountain of shortcuts and deception. He knew he needed help, so he hired a private investigator, a quiet professional with no ties to the area. Her job was to look beneath the surface, to peel back the outer layer of normalcy and find out how deep Karen's fraud really ran. What she discovered changed everything. First came the inspection reports, or rather, the lack of them. Most legitimate housing developments go through a series of inspections: soil testing, structural review, electrical and plumbing certifications. But none of those documents existed for Willow Heights. There were no inspection certificates on file, no final sign-offs from city engineers, and no permits for utilities. Somehow, Karen had bypassed every standard checkpoint in the development process. She hadn't worked within the system, she'd operated entirely outside of it. The homes looked beautiful on the outside, but that was part of the trick. They had fresh coats of paint, new shutters, and flower beds by the doors. But inside, the reality was very different. Plumbing systems were jerry-rigged. Electrical wiring was incomplete or dangerously overloaded. In some homes, outlets were dead. In others, water pressure dropped to nothing without warning. And most shocking of all, the sewer system for the entire neighborhood wasn't connected to the city's main line. Instead, it was a makeshift septic network hastily buried beneath the ground. No permits, no oversight, and no guarantee that it wouldn't collapse under its own weight. The investigator dug deeper. She found subcontractors who had worked on the project, some of them unpaid, others paid in cash under the table. Several had walked off the job after discovering just how unregulated the site was. One mentioned being told to skip the rebar when pouring foundations. Another said he was asked to install insulation made from compressed scrap paper because it was cheaper than fiberglass. Karen had cut every corner possible. Victor now understood that the homes were not just unauthorized, they were unsafe. And the homeowners, completely unaware, had poured their savings into buildings that could become uninhabitable within years, if not months. And legally, it was still his land. If something catastrophic happened, if a sewer line ruptured or a house collapsed, he could be held accountable. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery was what Karen had done to maintain control. The HOA she ran wasn't just strict, it was a tool for silencing questions. Homeowners were charged steep monthly dues, and any resistance was met with aggressive penalties. Several residents had been fined for things like parking in the wrong direction or planting unapproved flowers. There were complaints, of course, but Karen had built in layers of red tape. Residents who wanted to challenge her authority were met with threats of foreclosure or vague legal notices. She claimed her authority came from the development's charter, which, according to her, had been approved long before the first home was even built. But that was a lie. 2. Victor's investigator found the HOA charter had been copied word for word from a different community in another state. It had no legal standing in their county. Karen had simply printed it, stamped her name on it, and enforced it with confidence. And people had obeyed because they didn't know any better. She controlled everything: the board, the budget, the bylaws. She had made herself the unquestioned ruler of Willow Heights. Victor stared at the evidence piling up on his desk. Fake permits, illegal construction, false advertising, forged documents, stolen land. Families living atop danger they didn't even realize was there. He thought about the people, those kids riding bikes, the families grilling in their backyards, the retirees tending to tiny gardens, all believing they had found their forever homes. They had no idea they were living inside a house of cards, and that with the right push, it could all collapse. Victor didn't want to hurt them, but he had to act. He had to find a way to remove Karen without burning the entire community down. She had spun a web of lies, but she'd made one fatal mistake. She built it all on land that was never hers. And now, that landowner was watching. Victor Holloway knew the time for patience had passed. He had watched long enough, gathered more than enough evidence, and now it was time to act. But bringing down Karen Ellingsworth wouldn't be easy. She had embedded herself so deeply into the fabric of Willow Heights that pulling her out would feel like tearing down the entire neighborhood. If he came in too aggressively, he risked turning the innocent homeowners against him. If he acted too slowly, someone might get hurt living in those unstable homes. He needed precision. So he began, laying a quiet, calculated trap. The first step was legal. Victor consulted with a real estate attorney who specialized in land disputes. After reviewing the documents, the lawyer's verdict was immediate and clear. Victor was still the legal owner of the entire 40-acre plot. The development, the homes, the HOA, all of it sat on land that had never been transferred, sold, or leased in any way that held up in court. The original usage agreement Karen had drafted was vague and informal, offering her no real protection. Next, Victor filed a formal complaint with the county zoning board. He didn't mention Karen by name. Instead, he submitted a report questioning the legitimacy of the entire Willow Heights development, attaching drone photos, copies of missing permits, and a statement about land ownership. Within days, the county began investigating. Inspectors were sent to the site. Zoning officers quietly took photos and notes. Still, the neighborhood continued on, unaware of the storm building behind the scenes. Then came the audit. Victor's lawyer helped him request a financial review of the Willow Heights HOA under state nonprofit regulations. Though Karen ran the HOA like a private fiefdom, it was still subject to public scrutiny under certain laws. The audit request forced her to disclose financial records, dues collected, expenditures, salaries. It was a quiet but significant blow. For the first time, Karen felt pressure from outside her carefully controlled world. Still, she didn't seem to notice Victor. She likely assumed the complaints were from disgruntled residents or nosy regulators. She didn't know the landowner she had lied to was orchestrating the collapse from behind the scenes. And then Victor made his final move. He served an official eviction notice, not to the families or the homeowners, but directly to Karen Ellingsworth. The notice stated that she was unlawfully occupying and profiting from land she had no legal right to use. It demanded that she vacate any property, office, or administrative space connected to the HOA and development. It also notified her that any continued presence on the land would be treated as trespassing. Karen was stunned. She hadn't seen it coming. She had built so many layers of illusion that she believed her position was unshakable. But with one document, the foundation cracked. Within days, panic began to ripple through the neighborhood. Karen held emergency HOA meetings, trying to reassure residents that nothing was wrong. She sent out bulletins claiming Victor's notice was fake, a desperate attempt by a disgruntled outsider to disrupt the community. But cracks had already formed in her image. Residents began asking questions. Why hadn't they seen building permits? Why was there no record of sewer hookups? Why had property values quietly stopped rising? And most importantly, why hadn't Karen ever introduced them to the actual landowner? The county stepped in next. After weeks of quiet investigation, they released a report confirming that Willow Heights had been built without legal zoning approval or valid development permits. The news spread fast. Local media picked up the story. Headlines labeled it the invisible neighborhood, a community built illegally on land its developer never owned. Karen's name was front and center. Behind closed doors, lawsuits began. Piling up, homeowners demanded answers. Several banks, realizing they'd issued mortgages on fraudulent paperwork, began legal proceedings to protect their investments. Karen tried to disappear, shredding documents, closing accounts, avoiding service, but it was too late. Victor had not only exposed the fraud, he had done it without turning the neighborhood against him. In fact, many of the residents began turning to him for guidance. The man whose land they had unknowingly settled on had become their last hope of saving their homes. Karen had built an empire of lies. But empires fall not with noise, but with precision. And Victor had struck at the foundation she thought no one could see. Karen Ellingsworth had spent years building a kingdom out of deception. She crafted it from polished words, copied documents, and quiet threats, believing she had covered every angle. But when the truth finally caught up with her, it came faster than she could react. The eviction notice had shaken her, but it was only the beginning. The storm that followed wasn't just legal, it was public, humiliating, and permanent. The day after the county's report was released, news vans lined the streets of Willow Heights. Reporters stood on sidewalks, interviewing confused residents who were just learning their dream homes sat on land developed without permission. Headlines labeled the community a ticking time bomb. Every local channel ran features on the illegal subdivision and the woman behind it. Karen's face was plastered across screens with words like fraud, scammer, and unlicensed developer scrolling beneath. Homeowners were stunned. Many had moved in just months earlier, attracted by the promise of a safe, tight-knit community. They had paid HOA dues, attended meetings, followed rules, and now they discovered that everything, from their driveways to the sidewalks under their feet, had been built on stolen land. Karen tried to hold on. She called emergency HOA meetings, trying to convince people that it was all a misunderstanding. She claimed the county's report was based on technicalities and that she was working to resolve the matter. But the confidence she once wielded so easily had faded. Her voice trembled. Her words lacked conviction. People began to walk out of meetings before they ended, and then came the lawsuits. Victor's legal team filed a civil suit against Karen personally, not just her company. The charges included fraud, trespassing, unlawful enrichment, and intentional misrepresentation. He sought financial damages equal to the profit she had earned from selling and leasing homes on his land, millions of dollars, according to preliminary estimates. The courts responded quickly, freezing her assets and authorizing a full financial investigation. Buyers filed lawsuits, first a handful, then dozens. Some wanted compensation, others wanted out. A few feared the legal mess would leave them homeless. Mortgage lenders followed, demanding answers as to how they had financed homes without valid land titles. Karen's entire operation unraveled. In a matter of weeks, the HOA board, once made up entirely of Karen's loyal appointees, held a vote to remove her. It passed unanimously. Her authority was stripped away, and a temporary board was formed with the help of outside legal advisors. They began reviewing every document, every rule, every policy she had implemented. The results were shocking. Budgets had been falsified. HOA dues had been redirected to private accounts. Maintenance contracts had been awarded to shell companies under her control. Even the playground, praised by families for its safe, modern design, was built without any safety certification. Karen vanished from public view. She stopped answering calls. Her office emptied overnight. She didn't return to the neighborhood she had once ruled. When she was finally located, it was through a court-appointed investigator who found her living in a short-term rental under a different name. She was forced to return for court hearings, but each appearance stripped more dignity from the image she had so carefully constructed. Meanwhile, Victor did what Karen never had. He spoke directly to the homeowners. With his attorney's guidance, he held a public meeting, explaining the situation with calm, measured honesty. He expressed no anger toward the residents. Instead, he offered a solution. With the city's cooperation, he proposed a legal path to transfer land ownership to the homeowners properly, officially, and with full documentation. It would take time, and there would be costs, but it was a chance to salvage their homes and futures. The residents, wary but grateful, supported the plan. They were victims, not villains. They hadn't known the truth, but now they did, and most were willing to rebuild, this time the right way. Karen Ellingsworth had played a dangerous game, betting that charm and confidence could replace law and ethics. She believed no one would challenge her, especially not the silent landowner she once underestimated. But Victor Holloway had watched, waited, and struck with precision. In the end, she lost everything. Her reputation, her money, her control, and the land she stole. It remained unchanged, silent, permanent, just like Victor planned.